The water is ice cold. It always is. That's deliberate. The shower room at Magdalene Laundry in Dublin has no hot water valve, only cold, because the nuns who run this place in 1962 believe that warmth is a luxury fallen women don't deserve. The girl standing under the spray is 16 years old. Her crime was being pregnant and unmarried. Her punishment is this place, where she'll spend the next 4 years washing sheets in scalding laundry rooms during the day and shivering under cold showers at night. But the cold water is just the beginning. It's the psychological architecture around it, the shame, the silence, the systematic breaking of spirit that makes this punishment truly dark. We think punishment in women's prisons is about time served, about years counted behind bars. But throughout history, the darkest punishments have rarely been about duration. They've been about degradation, about transforming punishment into spectacle, into shame, into methods designed not just to punish the crime, but to destroy the woman who committed it. Tonight, we examine punishments that couldn't be written into official legal codes, but were administered nonetheless, hidden behind institutional walls, where society agreed not to look. The ducking stool appears in English legal records as early as the 1200s. On paper, it was a punishment for scolds, women who spoke too loudly, complained too often, disrupted the social order with their voices. The mechanism was simple, a chair attached to a wooden beam extending over a river or pond. The woman was strapped into the chair, sometimes gagged, always humiliated. Then she was dunked repeatedly into the water. In summer, this was uncomfortable. In winter, it was potentially lethal. But the true punishment wasn't the water. It was the crowd that gathered to watch, the neighbors who threw objects, the children who learned that women who spoke out of turn deserved public humiliation. These sessions could last hours. The woman would be raised and lowered dozens of times, gasping for air between immersions, her clothes soaked, her dignity stripped away by the laughter of spectators. Many communities erected their ducking stools in central locations, market squares, town centers, to ensure maximum visibility. The punishment was recorded in town documents, but what the records don't capture is the trauma of being displayed, violated, made into entertainment for a community that enjoyed your suffering. Some women died during these punishments, drownings recorded as accidents rather than executions. Most survived but carried the shame forever, their voices effectively silenced, not by the water, but by the memory of being held under it while their community watched. In American prisons of the 1800s, female inmates were subjected to the tranquilizer chair. This wasn't a medical device, but a torture instrument dressed in therapeutic language. Women who were considered hysterical, which could mean anything from crying to talking back to guards, were strapped into wooden chairs with metal restraints. Their arms were bound, their legs immobilized. Sometimes their heads were enclosed in boxes that restricted vision and muffled sound. They would remain in these chairs for hours, sometimes days, fed only liquids, forced to soil themselves because release for bathroom use was considered a privilege that had to be earned through proper behavior. Prison doctors of the era described this as calming treatment. They documented how women's hysteria would subside after time in the chair. What they were actually documenting was psychological breakdown, the point where a human being's will to resist collapses under the weight of immobility and sensory deprivation. Women who emerged from the tranquilizer chair were often described as reformed, as having overcome their difficulties. What they'd actually overcome was any belief that resistance to authority was possible. The chair didn't cure anything. It broke something fundamental. The Magdalene Laundries operated across Ireland from the 18th century, until 1996. Think about that date, 1996. These institutions, run by Catholic religious orders, weren't officially prisons. They were asylums for fallen women, homes for rehabilitation. But women sent there for crimes ranging from prostitution to pregnancy out of wedlock to simply being too attractive and therefore tempting men, couldn't leave. They worked without pay in industrial laundries, brutal labor that destroyed hands and backs and spirits. They slept in dormitories under the watch of nuns who enforced silence and separation. They were stripped of their names, given numbers instead, told their identities were too sinful to speak aloud. The punishments in Magdalene Laundries were sophisticated in their cruelty. Women who broke silence rules had their heads forcibly shaved, marking them as troublemakers visible to everyone. Women who resisted work assignments were locked in cold rooms without food for days. Women who tried to escape were captured and returned, then displayed to other inmates as warnings. But the darkest punishment was the one administered to pregnant women who gave birth in these institutions. Their babies were taken, usually within hours or days, and given up for adoption or sent to orphanages. The mothers were told they'd sinned too greatly to raise children. Were told that forgetting was their only path to redemption. Many never learned what happened to their children. The grief was the punishment, administered with bureaucratic efficiency and religious justification. In the 1960s and 70s, several American states operated rehabilitation programs for women prisoners that included forced sterilization. California led the way, with laws allowing sterilization of inmates deemed mentally unfit for motherhood. What mental unfitness meant in practice was extremely flexible. Women with criminal records, women with multiple children, women of color. Poor women. Women whose only documented mental unfitness was that they'd committed crimes. Between 1909 and 1979, California sterilized over 20,000 people in institutions, many of them women in prisons. The procedures were sometimes presented as voluntary, but voluntary is meaningless when the alternative is denial of parole or classification as high risk, requiring more restrictive custody. Guards would approach women nearing parole eligibility with suggestions that sterilization would demonstrate their commitment to rehabilitation. Would imply that parole boards looked favorably on women who ensured they wouldn't burden the state with future children. Women who refused were noted in their files as uncooperative, resistant to treatment, not ready for reintegration. The punishment wasn't just the forced surgery that removed their ability to have children. It was the elimination of their future, the severing of possibilities that extended beyond their sentences. A woman could serve her time, be released, rebuild her life, but could never undo the procedure performed in a prison medical facility by a doctor who saw her uterus as a threat to social order. Soviet gulags developed punishments for women that combined isolation with systematic humiliation. Political prisoners, women arrested for crimes as minor as telling jokes about Stalin, were sent to camps in Siberia where temperatures reached -40 degrees. The barracks had no heating. The work quotas for logging or mining were the same as men's, regardless of women's smaller physical frames. But female prisoners faced additional tortures designed specifically to exploit their vulnerabilities. Guards would conduct strip searches in public areas, forcing women to undress in front of male guards and prisoners. Women who menstruated had no access to sanitary supplies, forced to use rags or nothing. Their biological functions turned into sources of shame. Pregnant women in these camps continued working until labor began. Many gave birth in barracks with no medical assistance. The babies were taken from them and sent to special orphanages where survival rates were catastrophically low. Mothers were told that if they met their work quotas, they might be allowed brief visits with their children. This was rarely true. The dangled possibility of reunion became a tool of control, motivating women to destroy their bodies through labor in exchange for visits that never materialized. The punishment wasn't just the hard labor, or the starvation, or the cold. It was the hope, weaponized and used against them. In the American South during Jim Crow, Black women in prison faced punishments that white women didn't. The convict lease system allowed states to rent prisoners to private companies for labor. Women were sent to plantations, to lumber camps, to brutal work that would have been recognized as slavery, if not obscured by the word prison. Sexual assault by guards and overseers was so common, it wasn't considered noteworthy. Women who became pregnant in custody were blamed for seducing their rapists. Some facilities maintained nurseries where babies born to incarcerated mothers were raised until old enough for adoption or to join the labor force themselves. The punishments for resistance were horrific. Women who refused work were whipped. Women who tried to escape were caught and subjected to beatings that left permanent scars. But there was a punishment reserved specifically for Black women that combined physical pain with racial degradation. They were forced to work in fields wearing metal collars, heavy iron rings around their necks that announced their status. The collars were designed to be visible, to mark these women as less than human, as property of the state. And when they were finally released, if they were released, the scars on their necks remained, permanent brands that identified them as former prisoners in a society that would never let them forget. In some Asian prisons during the 20th century, female political prisoners were subjected to public self-criticism sessions. These were psychological punishments designed to break identity and enforce conformity. Women were forced to stand before assemblies of other prisoners and guards, confessing their crimes against the state. But confession wasn't enough. They had to analyze their thoughts, explain why they'd been counter-revolutionary, demonstrate understanding of their ideological failures. These sessions could last hours, with the prisoner standing, often without food or water, repeating her confession until it satisfied her interrogators. Women who couldn't produce satisfactory self-criticism were sent back to their cells to write more detailed confessions. This cycle could continue for weeks or months. The punishment wasn't physical torture, though that existed in these prisons too. It was the forced participation in your own psychological destruction. You had to articulate, in your own words, why you deserved to be there. Had to internalize the state's judgment of you. Had to speak your own worthlessness into existence repeatedly until you believed it. Modern prisons claim to have evolved beyond these barbaric practices. But talk to women in administrative segregation, who spend 23 hours a day in cells, barely large enough to lie down. Ask them about the sensory deprivation, the loss of time orientation, the way isolation makes reality dissolve. The mechanisms have been updated. The underlying principle, that breaking a woman's spirit is as important as containing her body, remains unchanged. The tranquilizer chair became the restraint chair. Same function, new name. Women in mental health crises are strapped into these chairs for hours, their treatment often consisting of being immobilized until they stop displaying symptoms. The ducking stool became the fire hose, used in American prisons through the 1960s to punish women who caused disturbances. The forced sterilizations became long-acting contraceptive injections administered without full consent, documented in several states as recently as the 2000s. The methods evolve. The cruelty adapts, but the target remains consistent: women whose bodies and behaviors deviate from what society will tolerate. What makes these punishments darkest isn't just their physical brutality, but their systematic denial. The ducking stool was legal entertainment. The tranquilizer chair was therapy. The Magdalene Laundries were homes for wayward girls. The sterilizations were voluntary procedures. The gulags were re-education. Every dark punishment came wrapped in language that obscured its nature, that allowed society to pretend it wasn't torture, because we called it something else. And perhaps what's darkest of all is that many of these punishments were designed and administered by other women. Nuns in Magdalene Laundries, female guards who conducted humiliating searches, women doctors who performed forced sterilizations, prison matrons who oversaw isolation cells. The system didn't just punish women, it recruited women to punish other women, ensuring that solidarity was impossible, that every woman in the institution could be either victim or perpetrator, depending on which side of the door she stood on. The women who endured these punishments rarely had their stories recorded. They were criminals, fallen women, enemies of the state, hysterics. Their testimony was considered unreliable, their suffering either deserved or exaggerated. But occasionally, evidence survives. Scars on bodies exhumed from unmarked graves at Magdalene Laundries, medical records documenting sterilization procedures that list criminal history as medical justification, photographs of women in restraint chairs, their eyes vacant in ways that speak to damage beyond the physical. Soviet documents detailing work quotas that no human could meet and punishments for failure to meet them. These punishments worked. They broke women in ways that served systems of control. They taught lessons, not just to the punished, but to everyone watching. They enforced boundaries around acceptable female behavior, punishing those who crossed them in ways designed to deter others from following. And they were hidden behind walls, both literal and metaphorical, where society's willingness not to see allowed horrors to continue for centuries. The darkest punishments ever used on women behind bars weren't anomalies. They were features of systems designed to control female bodies and behaviors that threatened social order. They were administered in the name of law, of religion, of medicine, of rehabilitation, and they persist in forms we've learned to accept as normal, as necessary, as the cost of maintaining order behind walls we've agreed not to look past. If you want to understand how punishment becomes torture when applied to women, whose only crime is often being women in circumstances society won't tolerate, subscribe to Prison Diaries. Because the darkest punishments aren't history. They're warnings about what happens when we allow systems to operate without scrutiny, when we trust that walls will contain not just people, but the knowledge of what we do to them.